we live in an age where nostalgia is at the center of our media and art. We're regularly seeing sequels made to classic franchises like Star Wars, Jurassic Park, and Ghostbusters. In addition to these continuing classics are new originals that play to our nostalgia in reference and settings, like the widely popular 80s themed Stranger Things. In art, music, theater, and architecture, new works created through a nostalgic lens is often referred to as neoclassicism. One definition of neoclassicism in the visual arts describes it as an aesthetic attitude based on the art of Greece and Rome in antiquity, which invokes harmony, clarity, restraint, idealism, and universality. So here we have these artists that are creating paintings and sculptures that are reminiscent of art hundreds and even thousands of years prior, but are more contemporary in terms of their subject matter, their coloring, shading, and other advanced techniques. In music, the 19th century composer Felix Mendelssohn fought to preserve the Baroque and classical styles of the prior 2 centuries, while his contemporaries were embracing Romanticism. The 20th century composer Igor Stravinsky also drew on elements of past styles, though he was a bit more experimental in terms of his tonality and instrumentation. Neoclassicism has always occurred in parallel to the traditional forms, the traditional progression of art. Traditional progress being minimalism in modern art or atonality in music. Today I would like to discuss another genre that is going through a neoclassical period: video games. In the mid-90s, at the invention of the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1, game developers became obsessed with incorporating realism and 3D graphics as much as possible. This follows what we will call the traditional progression of video game art and style, culminating with the latest generation of gaming consoles that demonstrate a borderline scary level of realism. You can see examples of this in games like first-person shooter games like the Call of Duty series, or cinematic action-adventure games like the Uncharted or Red Dead Redemption series. Where neoclassicism comes to play is through independent or indie game developers that are creating these games often favoring 2D elements, many of which have pixelated or other unique animation styles. They take more eclectic approaches to style and gameplay and often introduce brand new mechanics. Now, neoclassical games are not simply newer classic games. They differ in 3 main categories that I would like us to discuss further. The first being art and visuals, second is music and sound, and third is gameplay. So let's go ahead and start with art and visuals. The HD 2D style showcases pixelated characters and environments that are rendered with modern depth and lighting effects. These games are a nod to the classic Super Nintendo era role-playing games like the Final Fantasy series or Chrono Trigger. You can see examples of this art style in games like Octopath Traveler, Triangle Strategy, and Live Alive. Let's discuss some other pixelated styles. In these games, you have pixelated characters and environments, but they have some added depth effects, and there's also more fluid movement with higher frame rates. These games can be rendered either in a traditional 8-bit style, like what you would see in the Nintendo Entertainment System, or in a 16-bit style, like showcased in the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Some of these examples you can see in Shovel Knight, The Messenger, Carrion, and Axiom Verge. Games with hand-drawn art styles are rendered in a cartoon-like animated style. Yes, they have some depth, but they mostly lean heavily on the 2D aspect. You can find some of these games in the super fun animation styles of Cuphead, Spiritfarer, Hollow Knight, and Chicory, A Colorful Tale. Next, let's go ahead and move on to music and sound. The hardware for classic games were restricted to use simple synthesizers that produced a sound now referred to as chiptunes. So in many neoclassical games, they use these signature chiptune sounds, but they add in modern effects like additional reverb or echoes, and sometimes even mixing in live instruments as well. These games tend to contain more catchy melodies, like what you would hear in classic games, versus the sweeping orchestration or drone-like effects that you'll hear in many of the realistic cinematic games. You can hear some of these examples in the games like Celeste, Fez, Stardew Valley, and Eastward. Here's a quick clip to listen to from the soundtrack for Celeste. It's catchy, isn't it? Now, of course, not unique to neoclassical games, but many of these use orchestration. These games that use orchestration are still contain more catchy melodies than what you would hear in the large-scale orchestrated games, and they often feature solo instruments like a piano or a harp. Some of these games include Spiritfarer, Hollow Knight, and Ori and the Blind Forest. Now listen to this clip from Spiritfarer. You're going to want to go home and listen to these soundtracks now, aren't you? So fun, so catchy. Finally, let's move on to gameplay. Anybody who's ever played a classic game dreads seeing the following two words appear on the screen. Game over. Yes. Did anybody else's stomach sink a little bit when you saw that? It's like a punch in the gut. So classic games are known for their brutal difficulty, and anytime you get a game over, it sends you all the way back to the beginning of the game. In contrast, most modern games feature unlimited lives, more save points, or automatic saving. You can see some of these examples in games like Rayman Legends, Super Meat Boy, and Metroid Dread, to name a few. Many games have adopted this newer genre known as roguelike games, in which if your character dies, you do return to the beginning of the game. However, there are ways that you can permanently level up your character with each playthrough so that they're stronger on your next attempt. This, of course, contrasts with the traditional game over where you start at the beginning with no resources or progress at all. These games usually also feature procedurally generated levels, meaning that the level design and the character and enemy placement changes with each playthrough to add some variety for the player. You can see some examples of these roguelike games in Hades, Cult of the Lamb, Shovel Knight Dig, and Dead Cells. In an interview with the game developer for the game Dead Cells, he explains they designed the system so that if your character is jumping over a gap and just barely misses the edge, the system actually nudges your character forward to allow you to land successfully. Pretty interesting. Many other platforming games also have much more forgiving jumping mechanics in general to give more flexibility to the player. Many new games also have a variety of difficulty levels, ranging from easy to brutal, that can be selected from the beginning of the game, and many of them even allow you to change that difficulty level at any point during your playthrough. You can see some additional accessibility options in God mode in Hades, the time slow feature in Celeste, or mellow mode in Yoshi's Crafted World. Okay, so now that we've examined and discussed the video games neoclassical movement, we all have to ask this question, so what? What difference does it make if we know about this movement? Well, first, we can argue that because video games are following the same pattern of returning to classic techniques as we see in all other art forms, this legitimizes this medium as art. This opens up possibilities about how we study, analyze, and advocate for video games as art. We could start offering college fine arts courses like video game appreciation or video game history. We could allocate funding to video game research. Second, we should take a moment and examine why the video game neoclassical movement is taking place at all. In most of these other neoclassical movements, there were often social or political catalysts that led these artists to turn back to classic ideals. Are some of these aspects also influencing the video game neoclassical movement? Or are these game developers simply turning back to nostalgia because of rapid advances in technology? And finally, the video game neoclassical movement occurs within the span of a single lifetime, rather than returning to art from centuries or millennia prior. And I personally think this merits more investigation. Children gamers of the 80s are now game developers trying to relive their childhood using more modern advanced technology. Never before have we had the opportunity to speak with someone who has experienced an art form from its origins to its neoclassical return. What could we learn from these individuals? The world of gaming has never been more vibrant and exciting. As we all get lost in the fun of the gameplay, I encourage each of us to take a moment to stop and to revel at the artistic prowess of these game developers. Furthermore, it is my hope that we can bring this medium to the forefront of the fine arts community and advocate for video games to have a seat at the table of scholars of art. Thank you very much.